Hey YouTube, welcome back to my channel, Taylor Talks Tales. Today I have a very fun video for you. It is my summer horror book recommendations video. So, last couple weeks I have been coming up with this curated list of awesome summer reads, books that I personally really enjoy and that I think are excellent for reading in the summer. And what surprised me was that there are way more books on this list than I anticipated. So I tend to read a lot more in the fall, winter, and spring, and I prefer books that are set in the fall and winter usually because those are my two favorite seasons and I just read a lot then. And of course there are so many horror books that are set in the fall and winter, but turns out there are actually a lot of really well done and awesome and enjoyable books that are either set in the summer or would be good to read in the summer because they're either set like on a tropical island or by a beach, or there's like a creature feature, and I think those are really fun to read in the summer, or there's just something very summery to the story. So I ended up with a very large list, so I want to go ahead and just dive right into it. Really quick, I do want to mention that this isn't really in any particular order. The first book I'm mentioning because that was the first one I read, but other than that they aren't really in any specific order. Towards the end I have two books on this list that are technically not horror, but they're like dark fiction, magical realism that I know other horror fans like, so I think they would be fun to read in the summer, even if they aren't strictly horror. I think you guys would like it. And then the very last book that I mention is last for a very specific reason. But anyway, let's get into it before I start rambling on about stuff. Alright, first book I want to mention is Do a Key by Stephen King. This, surprisingly, is the first time that I have read this book. I've read a lot of Stephen King. In fact, I've pretty much read all of his work except for I need to get through The Dark Tower, which, spoiler alert, is what I'm planning on doing in July. I am so happy that I ended up reading this book. I just finished reading it. I started it on the first day of summer, and this was so fantastic. I'm going to have to update my Stephen King top list because I need to put it on there someplace. I think this is one of his like truly underrated works, I would say. I know a lot of people who have read this really love it, but it still seems like it doesn't get as much appreciation as some of his other work, which is a shame because I was really blown away by this, and it's just very unique. It was very well done. I appreciated the characters a lot, and it was just creative. Made me want to pick up paints and start painting again. But this book pretty much follows a gentleman named Edgar Fremantle. He works in construction or he kind of manages a construction company up in Minneapolis, and unfortunately goes through this horrific accident. He loses his right arm and shatters his hip, has some brain damage, and through the course of healing, he ends up basically getting divorced from his wife because his wife just can't handle the recovery process because it's pretty awful. And he decides to go ahead and relocate down to Florida for a year and just take time for himself to heal and recover, and he starts painting again because he used to do art when he was like in high school, and then many years later he decides to pick it back up. Very quickly it shows that he has a ton of talent and he enjoys his work. He starts meeting some of the other people on the island, becomes friends with them, but something is up with his art, and I don't want to spoil too much more, but it was so well done, and there's this fantastic friendship in this story that I really liked, and I always think we should have more friendships in fiction, especially adult friendships that are strictly friendships, and there's a lot of very quotable lines in this. It was just very well done. Underrated, and I think it'll be a great beach read. You can read it year-round, of course, but because the bulk of the story does take place, you know, on an island, and there's just a lot of imagery with like shells and water and sea life, and I was really happy to have read it in the summer. It got me in the summery mood, and I definitely recommend you pick it up if you can. Next book is also set on the beach, and that is The Elementals by Michael McDowell. So this book, it follows this family after their matriarch dies and they bury her, and she was an awful lady. The surviving family members decide to go take a trip down to their family estate that consists of 3 houses, and it's called Beldame, and it's on the coast of Alabama. So they pack up and they go down to these houses. Now, 2, 3 houses are normal, but the 3rd one is just filling up with sand, and they don't know what's causing it. And very quickly, you discover there's something very, very wrong with that house. This book, I really appreciate it because a lot of the very spooky, creepy things that happen in broad daylight. So, with a lot of horror, you're used to seeing things in the dark, in the woods, very creepy, gothic atmosphere. But this one has a gothic atmosphere, but a very bright and sunny, by the coast atmosphere. And for me, this was a perfect beach read, and I have read it multiple times, and I do typically tend to read this in the summer. I just think it works really well because there's just a lot of summery sensations and imagery, and when you're just by the beach yourself and you're reading this book, it's just very, very cool. So I highly recommend it. Michael McDowell is a fantastic author. I've liked everything I've read of his, and I definitely recommend checking this one out when you can because it's great and it would be perfect for this time of year. What I want to talk about is The Ruins by Scott Smith. So, this one can be pretty polarizing. And I know exactly why, and it's because of the characters. So this one, I enjoyed it. The first time I read it, I think I gave it 3 stars, but the second time I read it, I bumped it up to 4-ish because I do think it's a good novel, and it is so much better than the movie. Movie is not that great. And the novel, what's really interesting about the novel is that there are no chapters. So it basically reads like just one wild ride without any pauses whatsoever. This one follows the 2 American couples. They're in college, and they go down to Mexico, and they're just having a grand old time, just partying and drinking and doing all the things that you do when you're on a college trip. They end up meeting some Greek gentlemen, and these Greek gentlemen talk about this sort of secluded ruins area that they want to check out that's just in the middle of the jungle, and then everyone decides, hey, let's go do this, let's go explore, and then they're off exploring, and very quickly things go from bad to worse, and I don't want to go too much more into details. I don't want to talk too much about the plot. I think you should just go into it and experience it for yourself. But this book is really interesting because there's no one point in the book where it's like, oh, you did this wrong and everything fell apart. It's just, and this is oftentimes the case in wilderness survival situations when things turn into a crisis, is that it's just like little things adding up, where just bad decision after bad decision after bad decision add up, and that's exactly what happens in this book. And I'm not gonna lie, the characters can be a little insufferable at times, and they make some bad decisions, but I still appreciated them trying to survive, and, you know, it's very creative, what's killing them off. I really liked that a lot, and it definitely is a nail-biter, and the fact that it takes place in this tropical location, and you just feel the heat. I mean, there's this one scene where there's one guy is just, like, you know, really hot and hungover, and you can just picture that really well, and you're like, oh, I would feel so sick of being in that situation. But I do recommend checking it out. I think it's a very well done book. I appreciate it a lot. Just know that the characters, you kind of want to smack them around sometimes, and it's sort of hard to watch what's happening when they're making some very bad decisions, but ultimately I think it's a very enjoyable ride, very well done, and the writing is very good too. Next one, so the characters in this one are even more insufferable, but that's okay, I still enjoy it, and that is Jaws by Peter Benchley, which is also why I'm wearing my t-shirt. I will say, unlike The Ruins, where the book is way better than the movie, I actually think that the movie is better than this book. But I still think that you should check out the book, especially if you're looking for a fun creature feature book to just read along the beach. Peter Benchley has quite a few different ocean-themed horror novels. This one I still think is probably the best, although The Beast is enjoyable as well. And then he also wrote The Girl of the Sea of Cortez, which is not a horror novel, but is a fantastic ocean-based novel that I do want to talk about at some point. But Jaws, we all kind of know the story. Small town, ends up getting a shark problem with this killer great white shark who's killing people off, and there's a mayor who wants to keep the beaches open, and then you have Chief Brody, who is the police officer who wants to figure out how to stop this from happening and keep people from dying. So this is fun, very enjoyable. I have this kind of older copy here, and it's not, I would say the movie is better because the characters are better. But there is some interesting backstory in this book that will give a little bit of insight into the movie. So I think having like a double feature where you like read the book and then watch the movie and then kind of compare the two would be sort of fun. And the action doesn't, like in the movie I feel like the action is like pretty much constant throughout the whole thing. I feel like in the book it's a little slower to get started, but the last like 150 pages are like very intense, and also you do get a perspective of the shark in this book that I thought was very cool. So I do recommend checking it out. Great beach read, great 4th of July read if you do something like that, if you want to read a book around 4th of July. And, you know, I think it's always fun and interesting to check out the source material. So, there's Jaws. Next up is another creature feature, and that is the Montauk Monster by Hunter Shea. There are a couple Hunter Shea books I could have put on this list, but I put this one on. This is also a fairly recent read for me, and this is really fun. Very fun. In fact, I would say there are some elements very similar to Jaws in the fact that it's a creature feature that takes place in a coastal town, a vacation town that relies a lot on tourism, but it's a little different in the fact that I would say I like the characters better in this one, and the monsters are totally different, and how things are handled are different, and there's also like a government conspiracy theme to this book as well. Sort of reminiscent a little bit of Stranger Things. In fact, if you do like Stranger Things, this is kind of like, you know, there's some elements of that in this book, but without focusing on kids. This is very fun, and it's based off of the that creature that washed up on the shore like back in 2008, I think, that everyone was just freaking out and like, what is this? And got conspiracy theories going and everything. This is just a lot of fun. There are a lot of deaths in this, there are a lot of characters in this, and everybody is fair game for getting munched and chopped up and all that. It's a wild ride, a lot of fun, and perfect beach read because you can just kind of get into it and then not have to worry too much about it being like a really heavy book or a book that you really have to think super hard on. So definitely recommend picking this one up. Another one, and this is another Stephen King book, and that is Cujo. So one thing I do want to mention about Cujo is if you haven't read Stephen King before, I recommend not starting with this book because I don't think it's one of Stephen King's best books, but I'm not one of the Cujo haters. I know there are some people who like loathe this book, and I can kind of see why. There are some decisions were made with this story that not everyone is going to like. I enjoyed it. Again, not my favorite Stephen King, but it's not my least favorite. And I think reading this in the summer is a good decision, I would say, because a good portion of this book takes place when it's very hot out. And at one point, I mean, this is sort of a, you know, survival story involving a rabid Saint Bernard named Cujo, and there's a woman and her child, and they end up in a hot car, and they're stuck. They have this rabid dog out there, and it's just getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And reading that, if you're outside in the heat, just adds something to it. I've always read this book. I've read it a couple times. I haven't read it as many times as some of the other Stephen King books that I've read, but I've always read this in the summer, so I just in my mind associate it as being a summer book. Especially, I just think that when you're hot, reading about somebody who is dying in a hot car just adds something to your experience, I would say. So definitely check it out, but again, I would suggest there are some other Stephen King books to read first. In fact, I would recommend Duma Key over Cujo any day of the week, because I just think Duma Key was really fantastic. But this is still very, very enjoyable. And also, if you're just looking for a creature feature, sort of one of Stephen King's more, I wouldn't say simple books, but more straightforward books, then this would be one. another book I want to talk about, and I've mentioned this a few times on this channel already, and that's The Forgotten Island by David Sodergren. This one is a great summer read, I would say. Even though I read it in the spring, I would recommend reading in the summer because it takes place in a tropical location. So this story follows these two sisters, and they end up going to Thailand for a vacation, and they start out, you know, partying, getting to know people in the area, and you kind of see the dynamic between the two sisters and their relationship, figuring that out. And then at some point they end up on a boat, and then this boat ends up getting them to this forgotten island where stuff happens and happens very quickly, and it's just very neat once you get to the island, so I don't want to spoil anything, but the heat and the tropical location really adds to this story, and it's very prominent in the story, so I think it's a very, very solid summer read. Perfect if you yourself are going on a tropical vacation, or you just want to sit outside and pretend that you're on a tropical vacation, because who knows how much traveling anyone's going to be doing this summer. But I really enjoyed this a lot. There are a lot of homages to other horror stories, and like the video nasties and cannibal horror. There's just like so much in this, and I appreciate this story a lot. It's my favorite David Sodergren novel. I've read 3 of his books, and this is by far just, it blew me out of the water. I was not expecting, I had no expectations going into this, but I enjoyed it a lot, and again, perfect for this time of year. Next one up is Castaways by Brian Keene. So this book, I haven't really heard very many people mention this, but I think it's a really good summer read. It is not one of the best books on this list by any means at all, but I think it's fun. It pokes fun at like Survivor and those type of like survival reality shows, and I always think it's fun to poke fun at reality shows. Not hating on them, I don't watch them very much. And this one pretty much takes place, there's this show called Castaways, and they have these people who are trying to compete to win $1 million by being the last people on the island, and they have to do all these tasks, and they very quickly realize there's something wrong with this island. Even though it's supposed to be uninhabited, it's clearly not, and there's also a big storm that hits at the same time that something begins attacking everybody. And it's a very straightforward novel, but there's a lot of like blood and gore, and it's fun. I will say there's trigger warning for sexual assault, not from human to human, but something else, so just know that it's not super prominent in the story, but there are a few pages that are pretty graphic with that. But other than that, it's fun, entertaining, and very, very fast-paced and quick and easy to read. Characters, I actually like the secondary characters more than the main characters, but, you know, if you're just looking for something to read by the pool or on your own tropical vacation, this will be good with the action and the plot. I want to talk about is Gone South by Robert McCammon. This book, I adore this book. I highly, highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite Robert McCammon books aside from Boy's Life and Swan Song. This one summer plays a role in this because it takes place in August in Louisiana. So it's just a very hot book, and I really liked that. I've read this twice now, and I read it both times also in the summer. Not necessarily intentionally trying to do it, but I just ended up picking this up one summer, and I'm like, oh yeah, you know, you can just feel the heat. And this story, you follow a gentleman named Dan, and Dan, there's circumstances that lead to him killing somebody, and then he's on the run, and he ends up hiding out in the Louisiana bayou, where he meets this one girl who's very disfigured and is wanting to find this healer that is supposed to be hidden somewhere in the swamp. So the two of them team up, and they sort of almost have like a father-daughter relationship going on. And in the meantime, there is this 3-armed hitman and this guy who is like an Elvis impersonator who's also training to be a hitman. Very funny. I love it so much, the dynamic between those two. Those two hitmen are trying to track Dan down because he has a hit on him because he or they're basically like bounty hunters, I guess, rather than hitmen. So these bounty hunters are trying to track him down, and then the story goes from there, and takes place in this hot bayou, and I just think it's a really good summer read if you're looking for something a little bit darker and like a very well done storyline and very memorable characters. I definitely recommend this. Definitely check it out. Next one up is The Summer I Died by Ryan C. Thomas. So before I go into any more details, I want to say this is the most graphic book on this list besides the one book I mentioned at the very end of this novel. So if you haven't read horror before, I suggest picking something else up first, or just know going into this that it can make you pretty uncomfortable because it's very graphic and very intense. I enjoy this book because it's at its heart it is this survival novel, and I really appreciate what the characters have gone through, and they still keep on going, but it just is quite graphic. I would say it's not a book that everyone's going to be comfortable with, but I enjoyed it. So with this book, it follows two boys, or college kids. You have one boy named Tooth and the other is Roger. Roger is home from college, and he and Tooth are best buddies and have been best buddies for many years, and they decide to go shooting one day because Tooth is really into target shooting, so they're out shooting, having fun, and, you know, it's just like a very summery, fun feel of the first, like, 50 pages of the book, and then things go south very quickly when they hear screaming in the woods, and they decide to go investigate, and seriously, things happen very quickly from that point on, and then it becomes a race for survival when they wake up and realize they are in a very, very bad situation. So, very intense. This is technically, I think, part of a trilogy. I have not read the other two books in this series because I think this book stands by itself. It can be a standalone novel, and at some point I'll probably go check the other two books out, but in the meantime, I felt like this was, you know, well done book. It takes place in the summer, and it is more on the extreme, I wouldn't say splatterpunk, but it's more just on the extreme type of horror, because the vast majority of it takes place in a basement with a lot of, like, body horror and stuff happening, so just be prepared for that, but it is very intense. A true nail biter. I actually was, like, literally nibbling my nails off because it was that intense, and I do highly recommend it if you're looking for something pretty extreme. Next two, we have Kill River and Kill River 2, which I like these covers quite a bit. I'm only going to talk about the first Kill River, though, because Kill River 2 is a sequel. But Kill River, this book is a perfect summer read. Super just, I couldn't really imagine reading these books any other time of the year, actually. A lot of the other books on my list, you could totally read it in winter and doesn't matter. But these are just, they were meant to be read in the summer, I swear, because the first book starts off, there's a girl named Cindy, she's 13, and she's super into music, especially she's like super obsessed with the Go-Go's and like other 80s music, because this takes place in the 80s, and her parents end up sending her to summer camp, and it's a camp where she is one of the older kids there. There's 3 other campers that are around her age, and everybody else is significantly younger, and this camp is pretty poorly run, and there's some awful counselors, and so the 4 older kids, they start bonding, and they realize, you know what, we should just peace out of here because this just sounds like an awful situation, and they decide to flee camp one night, and they end up at this empty water park, and things happen from there. But I personally really like water parks and camp as well, so it was a very enjoyable story. They aren't, you know, like super deep books, but they're fun. They're very entertaining, and it just really feels like you're just watching like an 80s slasher movie just put into a book. And I just really liked the location, and it was fun, and, you know, the main character Cindy is sympathetic enough, and, you know, there's also music playing a little bit of a role in this. In fact, I think both books have a playlist at the back, if I remember correctly. And the third book just came out, and I haven't read it yet, but I am really looking forward to it because these, again, just perfect reads, and if the water park near my house opens up this summer, I definitely am going to take the third book with me in case I just want to lay out by the wave pool or something, but these were fun. Next we have Camp Slaughter. This one is summer camp horror in a way, because this doesn't actually take place when there are campers at a camp, but it follows these college students who end up renting a cabin in the woods in Pennsylvania, and they aren't very far from where this camp was, where there's like this massacre that happened, and there are other weird things that are occurring in the woods around there. And what's really interesting about this story is that I think it was very well done, because there are some tropes in this that horror fans will like. You're like, yeah, I recognize that, oh, I do that, but also does its own thing too, and it definitely leaves it open for a sequel, and I'm definitely going to pick up the sequel because I thought it was just well done. Very straightforward writing style, and it just keeps the plot going, and you do root for some of the characters, and there's, you know, good kill scenes, and the antagonist is really interesting, and I definitely think that Sergio Gomez brought a unique element to the villain, and I just thought it was a really well done book. And it takes place, of course, in the summer as well. It doesn't, I think you could read this any time of year. Like, the summer element isn't super, super strong, but I still think that it works well to read in the summer as well. And, you know, we've got this abandoned camp, and I just thought that was very, very cool, and it's just very well done and enjoyable. Next one I want to bring up is also a summer camp horror, and that is Kill Hill Carnage by Tim Meyer. So this one, I would say out of all the stories on this list, this is like the most loosely associated summer novel, because though it does take place in the summer and there is a camp involved, really you could kind of read it any time of the year because it's not a very strong presence in the book of it being summer. But if you're looking for summer camp horror, this would be a good suggestion, I would say, even though the bulk of the story doesn't necessarily take place at the camp, but the characters end up where they end up because of a camp. So similar to Camp Slaughter, there was a massacre that happened in the 90s on Kill Hill, where there's a camp called Camp Christopher, and all the campers ended up getting brutally murdered, and they ended up calling this situation the Kill Hill Carnage. And the present day follows these college students, and they decide that they want to go check out Kill Hill and Camp Christopher, because they, especially one of them, is like super into true crime and real life horror, and they're all college students. They're kind of looking for something fun to do for the weekend because they don't really get to see each other a whole lot, and they decide to go on a weekend trip. And when they get there, things quickly become very bad, very fast. In the meantime, there is a parallel story happening that involves Kill Hill and potential pollutants and mutations and a lot of stuff. So this is significantly different from Camp Slaughter at that point, because this focuses more on this potential weird mutation thing happening, and this like almost Lovecraftian element that has to go on with the factory and this chemical that's in the water. And it's really interesting. Definitely worth checking out. Pretty brutal, a lot of body horror, so if you like body horror, you'll like this. If you don't like body horror and just Lovecraftian stuff, you may want to stay away from this, but I liked it. It's not one of the better books on the list, but it was still enjoyable, I would say. Okay, so I also wanted to include, I'm only going to briefly talk about this because it's not like super, super summery in my mind, but I still think it would be probably a pretty good summer read, and that's Ghostland by Duncan Ralston. This story does take place in the summer, and it's theme park horror. So out of some of the other theme park books I was thinking of putting on this list, I ended up choosing this one because the fact that it does take place in the summer, and I always think it's fun to read about a theme park with ghosts. It's almost like Jurassic Park meets like 13 Ghosts, and it's a very cool novel, and I really appreciate that there's a website that ties into the story. I definitely recommend checking that out, but pretty much you follow the story. Two friends who decide to, on opening day, go check out Ghostlands, because it's in their town, and they want to see all the ghosts, and things go wrong very quickly, and it's quickly a survival story about these two friends and a few other characters that they meet along the way, trying to prevent a catastrophe that expands out of the theme park, and trying to survive and seeing what they can do to stop the ghosts. And there's also this, you know, almost a conspiracy element to it, and I thought it was very fun and very enjoyable. And you know, there are some other theme park books, but I think this one would probably be a good one to read over the summer. Next book I want to talk about, in fact, these next two I'm just going to only briefly talk about because I've mentioned them on my coming of age horror video. In fact, one book, I swear, I've had it on multiple lists already, so you guys are probably tired of me bringing it up, but it just works on several of my lists because it has a lot going for it. First one is It by Stephen King. The reason why I think this is a good summer read, a couple different things. One is that the kids portion of it takes place in the summer. So they're biking around in Derry and it's summertime, and I think that coming of age and horror work really well together. I feel like there are plenty of coming of age horror stories that do take place in the summer because kids are, you know, going on adventures, they don't have to worry about school, and oftentimes parents aren't watching them as closely, and you know, I do think that plays a role in it. And you know, I just picture, when I picture it, I do picture the kids biking around in the summertime. And I've also always read this book in the summer. The first time I ever read this, I was actually at camp, summer camp. I brought this along with me, and because I was kind of shy and introverted when we weren't doing activities, I oftentimes would just disappear into it. And I think also too, because it's a very large book. I think if you have a little bit more free time in the summer, this will be a good choice to read. Plus, it's just a fantastic horror novel. It's just one of the top ones out there and one of the top Stephen King books. So I definitely recommend giving this one a shot. And you know, I do think that it would be a good summer read. Other one that's sort of coming of age theme is Children of the Dark by Jonathan Janz. This one is set in the summer. It pretty much starts the book off, it's the very beginning of summer, and there's a baseball game going on, and I think throughout this story, the fact that it does take place in the summer adds to it. Not only are the kids not in school, but they're also traipsing around in the woods and, you know, having fun in the creek, and there's a lot of other situations that just, you know, the fact that it takes place in summer adds to the story, and you can really feel it in the book. So definitely a good coming of age novel, set place in the summer. You follow a boy named Will and his friends as they realize that A, serial killer is coming to their town, has escaped and is coming right for them, and B, there's some strange phenomenon going on in the woods that slowly starts killing people, and things escalate very quickly, but very enjoyable, very fun. I don't want to give too much away about the plot, but it's a good one. These next two I'm mentioning, these are the books that are not specifically horror, but I think horror fans would really enjoy them both. So, first one is The Summer That Melted Everything by Tiffany McDaniel. So, every person I follow or interact with who likes horror and has read this book loves this book. And I can totally see why. I really enjoyed it as well. I would say at its heart, it's a magical realism story, but it has some very dark elements to it. This book follows the main character's father invites the devil to town. Essentially, he puts an ad in the newspaper and says, you know, hey, if you're the devil, I want to, like, come talk to you and debate you, and that draws in this 13-year-old African-American boy who claims he's the devil. And his arrival into this small town in Ohio, it's spelled breathed, but it's pronounced breathed. It impacts the entire town, and some tragedies happen, and there's a lot of is he the devil? Isn't he the devil? And a lot of like thought-provoking things happen, and it's beautifully written, and summer plays a huge role in this story. Oh my gosh. Like, this book would have had a totally different feel if it was not set in the summer. Like, you just feel very hot when you're reading this, and the fact that there's all that town, ice cream melted and was destroyed, and it's very, very unique. I'm really excited to see what else this author will be writing. I know she has a new book coming out that I think is also supposed to be sort of a grittier magical realism book, but there's definitely some dark elements to this, and sad too. And in fact, I would say the climax of this is a horror climax. I don't want to give anything else away, but I do think that what happens is pretty horrific and pretty sad. So I would recommend this if you were looking for that kind of intense story. And it's very lyrically written, and I would consider it to be cross-genre and partially horror. The other one I want to talk about is Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury. So this one I wanted to bring up, even if it's not traditionally a horror story, I do think it is very well done. And Ray Bradbury, he does what he did for Autumn in Something Wicked This Way Comes, October Country, and The Halloween Tree. He does for summer in Dandelion Wine. Reading this, you can't help but feel nostalgic for summers. I don't even like summer that much, and I just fell in love with the idea of summer and felt very nostalgic for my own childhood summers, and it's just beautifully written. There's so many quotes in this story. It's just amazing. I will say this is more like it's not a short story collection, but all the stories are like loosely connected. There's sort of a couple main characters, but it's just told in a very interesting way. So just know it's not like this chronological, like this is, you know, the plot and it's just plodding along. It's more meandering, but the reason why I put it on this list, one, it's just the perfect summer book. Like, it is summer, just in a novel. But one of the stories is really like a horror story because it has to deal with a serial killer who is killing some of the women in this small town, and there are also some supernatural elements in some of the other stories, so it definitely has some magical realism and fantasy elements and paranormal elements in the book. So there are definitely some creepy scenes. Like, there's this one scene in particular where the main character is describing, like, being scared of this, I think it was a ravine. There's, like, some place where he was, like, really scared, and I just remember, like, being a very little kid walking home at night, and you're, like, things just creep you out. So I definitely think giving this a shot, even if it's not horror per se, I do think that horror fans would still really like it. So definitely recommend. And of all the books on this is like the most summery, like it's the most summery you can get because it's just all about summer. Last book that I'm going to mention, and I'm mentioning it last for a reason, not because it's not good, but because it's an incredibly intense book. It is one of the most intense books I have read. And it's The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. This takes place in the summer. In fact, the whole reason why this book, the things that happen in this book happen, is because it's summer break. And in a way, this is sort of a warped coming-of-age novel. I actually debated putting it on my coming-of-age horror, but I left it off. But now I do think I will put it on this summer reads. I want to caution readers, though, because there's one time I had talked to somebody about potentially reading this, and they got very upset. So, just know, this is, unlike The Summer I Died, which is a intense book, but it's fun in a way, because you're like, oh, are they going to survive? And it's, you know that it's not real. The fact that this book was based off of a real situation, unfortunately, where this poor girl who was 14 years old was just brutalized. She was tortured, raped, just all these terrible things happened to her by this one woman and a bunch of boys in the neighborhood, and people kind of had an idea that was going on, and nobody stopped it until it's too late. And that's what the story's about. It's hard-hitting, and it's not light. it's one of the reasons why I almost didn't include it on this list, but at the same time, like the fact that summer does play a strong role in this. I mean, the main character meets the girl when they're looking for like a crawfish in a stream, and there's scenes where there's like, you know, the boys are going swimming, and there's like a bunch of stuff that, you know, you know it's summertime, and the whole reason why it happened was because it was summer, because it was in the fall, winter, spring. People would wonder why this poor girl wasn't in school, but there's a lot. I do want to do a full-fledged review on this book because I think it is very well written. I think that there is a powerful message to this story that I think a lot of people miss, and I don't think it's gratuitous or exploitative in the way that a lot of people say it is, but it's not a fun book. Like, it's just one of those things where you read it, it's important. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, but it's not, out of all of these books, it's my least enjoyable just because it's so intense. And it's because it deals with child abuse, and it does it in a way that it's very graphic and, you know, just brings up a lot of things. So just trigger warnings for just so many things in this book, but if you are up for it, I do think it is a rewarding book to read because it's extremely dark and it's very thought-provoking, and it kind of shows a very evil side of humanity. Actually, there's one more. I want to bring in honorable mention because I really love this book, but I don't think it's the most summary of the books that I talk about in this list, and that's Boy's Life by Robert McCammon. Even though this is coming of age and it takes place in the South, and there is a portion of this book that does happen over the summer, it does take place over an entire year in this boy's life, in his like relationship with his dad, and like all the things that are happening. So it's not strictly focusing on summer, even if it's coming of age. So that's why I say it as an honorable mention. I want to mention it as well because I kind of put this up there with it as well. I kind of think that if you like one, you like the other. And this is a little less into the horror and more into, you know, maybe magical realism and thriller and crime, and just overall it's just a very solid novel. But I did want to mention it even if the majority of the book doesn't necessarily take place in the summer. There are parts of it that take place in the summer, so I figured I would mention it. Alright, thank you guys so much for watching my video. I hope that you enjoy all the books that you end up reading this summer. I hope you like a couple of these, and there are a few others that I didn't include in this video, but I'm interested to see what are some of your favorite summer reads. Let me know down below in the comments, and please like, comment, rate, subscribe, and I will talk to you guys later. Happy reading.